Afternoon. I'm Graham Wilson, the Director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. One of our many roles is to bring together experts and policymakers in the realm of urban governance. Today, we have as a guest someone who has combined both these roles. We're honored to have with us today David Miller, Director of Diplomacy for the C40, the leading group of cities around the world working together to address the existential crisis of climate change. In spite of its name, around 100 cities belong to the C40, the great cities of the world around every continent. David was previously a much admired mayor of Toronto. He's recently published a book that I highly recommend, Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Solving the Climate Crisis. And it's just been published by the University of Toronto Press. Another of our goals at the Initiative on Cities is to share best practices between cities. David's book is a major contribution to this, describing how cities have used their powers to make real progress in attacking climate change. David, let me start by asking you this. I first read your book before the election of Joe Biden to the US presidency. To me, at that time, it was a beacon of hope. Good, imaginative policies were happening at the city level, whilst things looked bleak elsewhere, particularly here in the United States. Mayors like Livingstone, going back a few years now in London, Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles, had got out in front of public opinion and were taking a lead on addressing climate change. So we had a stark contrast between, at best, stagnation and often going backwards, all too often going backwards in this country on tackling climate change, and mayors taking the lead. Why and how have mayors been able to do this? What makes mayors different in this regard?
Well, thanks very much, Graham, for the kind introduction and for all of the work of the BU Initiative on Cities. It's a terrific body of work, not just the Menino survey of mayors. And I mention that partly because I think it's aligned with the reasons why city-based action on climate change matters so much. And I think the first answer to your question is pretty straightforward, but there's a second part and a third part. And the first answer to your question is the reason that mayors are leading is, first of all, because they can, and secondly, because they must. And it's in a context of a world that today is now predominantly urban. And that's a very recent phenomenon. Until about 2008, 2009, the world since the dawn of human civilization had been predominantly rural. That is, more people had lived in rural areas than in urban areas. And at the end of the first decade of this century, that line was crossed. And the trend to urbanization is accelerating because of what's happening in China and India, and to some extent in Latin America and Africa as well. We are becoming an urban world. So that's where the people are. Secondly, that's where the emissions are. According to our studies at the C40, about 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are in cities. So of course, if you want to address the problem, you address it where it is. And then thirdly, that's where the bulk of the world's economy is. So the first answer is, mayors can address climate change, and because the bulk of the world's emissions are in cities, they have an obligation as well. But that's only really part of the issue from my perspective. The great cities of the world are fixing the climate crisis because of a combination of city government powers and the way city governments tend to work with the people who live there. So city governments are responsible for transportation. They're responsible for buildings, all around the world. Steering and guiding development, new buildings is a core part of city responsibilities. In many cities, thinking about old buildings as well is is a part of their responsibility as well. They're responsible for urban forests, they're responsible for parks, they're responsible for water, they're responsible for social services, public health. So many activities that are connected inextricably to climate change, and we can explore that later. In fact, the 70% of greenhouse gas emissions I mentioned are predominantly in 4 areas: transportation, how we generate electricity, how we manage our waste, and how we heat and cool our buildings. And cities have either direct or indirect influence over all of those things. And the final point is a subtle one, but I think it really matters. You know, polls have showed for a very long time that people deeply care about climate change. City governments are an order of government that don't just pass policies, they take action, they run things, they run transit systems, they pick up waste, they clean the water, they actually plant and maintain trees, for example, part of the urban forest. And in doing their responsibilities, they also, sometimes by law, but sometimes by preference, have very systematic ways of engaging with their residents. And as a result, there is a unique combination, I think, in city governments between governments that don't just think about the right thing to do, actually do it, and both develop the policy in partnership with their residents and undertake the actions in partnership with their residents. And that creates an incredible possibility, given the responsibilities that cities naturally have, of urban-based climate leadership. And that's, I think, what we've seen over the last 15 years or so.
That's goes to the next question that I was going to ask you, which is that I've had the advantage of reading your book. Not everybody who's watching has, although I hope they will rush out and get it on their Kindles or order it from their bookstores. But a lot of people would say, oh, well, it's nice that cities have got climate policies, but it's really national governments that count. How would you respond to that sort of, I'm sure you get that sort of line of comment a lot. How do you respond?
Yeah, I get quite puzzled by this. I mean, I've, as you know, Graham, I was an elected official for 16 years. I was involved in municipal politics directly and indirectly for probably almost a decade before that. So let's say about 25 years of involvement with municipal government, and then another 10 post my time in office. And I'm always asked why cities, and I'm quite baffled by this because it's quite obvious to me, based on the points I said. Now, national governments have an important role. It's not to diminish it, but if we think about, let's think about a success of national level policy action. A fairly recent success 5 years ago was the Paris Accord. People, climate activists, everybody trumpeted this. It was incredible. That was at COP21. COP21 was the 21st conference of the parties under the Kyoto Accord, discussing how to implement an international agreement that we needed to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those conferences happen once a year. So it took 21 years for national governments to agree that everybody had to have a climate plan. That a city government cannot act that slowly. A mayor would be thrown out. She wouldn't have a chance for re-election. It's just not possible because people's expectations around actions that their mayors do are to meet immediate challenges. And as concern justly continues to rise about climate, given the increasing severity and frequency of storms, the last few weeks we've seen 2 Category 4, I think, hurricanes in Nicaragua. It was thought impossible scientifically that could happen back to back like that. Houston had 3 1 in 500 year storms within 4 years. Australia wildfires, flooding and massive flooding, biblical flooding in Jakarta. City constituents wouldn't say, let's think about this for 21 years and finally agree to act. And so for me, the very big difference, national governments, of course, have an important role. And the election of President-elect Biden has freed the world up to talk about climate change and act. But as we know from President Obama's time in office, simply having a president that wants to do the right thing on climate change doesn't mean the United States of America will do it. And the fact is, most of the advances in the US on climate over the last decade have come from three places: city-based climate action, including cities agreeing to stay in the Paris Accord when President Trump said he would leave it; from natural effects of the market, particularly coal no longer being cheap relative to wind and solar; and some other subnational action like the northeastern states and California. So for me, it's the other way around to some extent. You know, national governments, even those that say the right thing, like the United States and the current government in Canada, have terrific difficulty in taking the right action, partly because of the lobbying of industry and others, partly for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me. Cities are very differently placed. So my answer to that question is why cities? Because that's where we can have effective action now, and we need effective action now. In fact, if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees, which is the level of global heating that scientists say we need to stay within, we have to, roughly speaking, have greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030. And the only real way you can do that is by taking the best ideas that are happening in some cities around those four areas: buildings, how we generate electricity, transportation, how we manage waste, and spread them quickly at pace and scale. If national governments could help and could finance things, particularly around public transport, cleaning the electricity grid, that will make it much, much easier. But the only way I think we can get to where we need to is taking the good things that are happening somewhere that are technically and economically feasible and do them everywhere. And essentially, that's the thesis of my book.
So, David, let's hope that we have a good-hearted mayor watching, but who hasn't yet got going on a policy for her city of tackling climate change. How would you advise that mayor to start? Or perhaps to put the same question a slightly different way, if you're a climate change activist and your mayor isn't doing anything yet, what should you be pressing your mayor to do? What's the starting point?
Well, read my book would be one.
I agree.
No, I'm sorry. That's completely in jest. The starting point for any city is to do a greenhouse gas inventory, see where your emissions are, and then craft a plan in accordance with science. You need to do your share of 1.5 degree trajectory. At C40, we have one program. There's a way to do that. We call it Deadline 2020, and I can explain that in a bit, Graham, if it's of interest. But cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, which is very interesting. The world capital of the oil industry has a climate plan that's highly advanced, have mapped out their plans. You need to engage people in doing it because it's very important to meet their needs. There's an aspect of equity to this that is really critical. And if you don't engage people when you're doing the plan, their needs aren't going to be met, and they might not agree with the plan and support you and do what they need to. The places you need to focus on are pretty clear. Cleaning the electricity grid, if you own the utility, that's pretty straightforward in terms of at least strategy. If you don't, there are lots of things. Boston has been looking at a buying co-op with hospitals, the city, all the big consumers of electricity to make sure that clean energy comes into Boston and area, for example. Very significant focus on reducing the use of natural gas and oil in buildings and in electrifying transportation. So I think the first step is do an inventory, then craft a plan, and learn from what's happening in the world's great cities. They have broken the barriers, which really is one of the ideas behind the C40. When the cities with the most resources solve a problem, it's much easier for others to take up the baton.
Thank you. Your book came out as the COVID crisis was unfolding. Unfortunately, of course, it's now accelerating again. And you added a postscript about the relationship between the COVID crisis and the theme of your book. I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit more about COVID and cities and climate. Are cities going to bounce back? We saw the tremendous drop in pollution levels as the economy tanked. But of course, the fear is that when the economic recovery that we all hope for happens, that we'll just go back up to the previous levels. So do you want to say a bit more about COVID and the cities and the climate crisis?
Yes, it's a really important point, Graham. The book came out in October, so I finished it June, I think. So we were partway into the pandemic. I think what we've seen in COVID, in the first wave and the beginning of the second wave, was very much an urban phenomenon. Of course, in the United States, we're now seeing it become a rural phenomenon. One could argue it's because governors in those particular states refused to undertake rather sensible precautions like promoting mask wearing and social distancing and so forth. Doesn't really matter. What does matter is, at least in the first wave, it was a really urban phenomenon. So at C40, one of the things we did was convene a task force of mayors under the direction of Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles, our chair, but the chair of the task force was Mayor Sala from Milan. And we did other work about COVID response, which is quite interesting, but I don't think relevant to this question, although happy to talk about it. Our work on COVID recovery centered on two things. What are the best practices globally of what cities are doing to recover economically and socially from COVID? And what should national governments be doing to assist that? And just a few things here. The first thing is cities are being incredibly creative. In the context of an organization of mayors thinking about climate change, they have been very creative in addressing other issues. And I'll give a small example, Lisbon. Many cities face a significant challenge of affordable housing in the core, forcing people who are of more modest means to live further and further from the center, people who often work in the center. This creates environmental challenges, including climate change, as people commute, either by vehicles they own or on public transport, but in many places, both of which are highly polluting. There's also a social challenge with people being pushed to neighborhoods further and further away, and perhaps people tending to live in almost segregated ways, depending on your income. Well, what Lisbon did in response to the COVID crisis, their economy is highly dependent on tourism. A lot of their city core was used for short-term rentals like Airbnb. In COVID, of course, that stopped. So what they did to address affordable housing, transportation, greenhouse gas emissions, social equity, was they rented on long-term leases the properties that used to be rented for very short-term purposes, and have re-rented those properties to working people, lower-income working people, who work in the city but live outside. And it has met multiple goals. That kind of creativity in the city response to COVID, I think is very, very inspiring. At the same time, we did research, and this was sobering to me. The research showed that if national governments, the very little of current stimulus is going into green stimulus, maybe 3 to 5%. If national governments invest significantly in a green and just stimulus today, we can help get, particularly in cities, we can help get the world back on track to halving emissions by 2030. But if they don't, because the stimulus is going to have such an impact on the global economy and on the economy of our cities, the world has very little chance of getting back on track, despite what's happening at subnational level. So the way stimulus money is used over the next year is going to be critical. I would argue that it should not just be green and just, it should be urban. That's where it's going to be most effective. That's where the people are. That's where the social and economic challenges are. And our study also shows that's essential.
So, David, we've got a number of questions that have already come in from the audience, and let's turn to those. But let me also remind the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we look forward to getting even more questions from the audience than we've got already, and we'll try and make sure that we get all the questions answered. So Alistair asks, basically, whether the trend that we'd been so excited about before COVID of people returning to the cities and moving into the cities and that wonderful sense of vitality that cities had, is that coming to an end because of COVID? Anecdotally, you hear of people rushing to buy in the suburbs or even more rural areas. Will cities bounce back, do you think, David, or is this a turning point where that sort of optimism of cities is coming to an end?
I'm old enough to have lived through when New York essentially went bankrupt and has bounced back just fine. So I'm naturally skeptical of predicting a long-run trend based on a few isolated stories. And I think one could powerfully argue that those who have sort of left cities tend to be amongst the very top income earners, if not the top 1%, the top 5% or so. So I find that hard to see happening. In fact, I think some other trends are more persuasive because they're more fundamental. Work from home. There is going to be more work from home post-COVID than there was before, because a couple of things are not going to change. A lot of people like working from home, at least to some extent. Maybe not all the time. They miss social life with the office. They don't want to have childcare issues, whatever. But much more than before, people are going to work from home because they want to, and because companies have discovered they can do so affordably and effectively. And for those with renting space in a downtown core, which is very expensive, there's a huge economic driver to encouraging work from home. So more people are going to work from home. Secondly, people have retaken possession of city streets in various cities. There's this idea of the 15-minute city that I think is relevant to the answer of this. But people have taken possession in some cities. Cafes are now on streets. Other cities, it's bike lanes. Other cities have widened sidewalks by taking lanes away from cars. I don't think people are going to surrender that very much. People have also demanded access to really great green space. So when you're shut in all day on Zoom, you can get outside and be part of nature, be part of the city, and the best cities are encouraging this. So I think what the trends are saying, actually, if you put all those things together, particularly people working from home, that's going to drive some economic and social changes around neighborhoods. And there's a movement in Europe and elsewhere. Montreal's doing a lot, Milan, Paris, some other cities, to create what are called 15-minute city, which really means that people should have all their services available within 15 minutes walk or biking from their house. The trends I see that have legs are going to encourage that. So I think we're going to see something a bit different. I don't think we're going to see a mass exodus from cities, although if some well-off people move out, maybe that will help the housing market and affordable housing. I don't know. I think what we're going to see is cities that are much more neighborhood focused, thought about what we do in the central business district, and it'll drive some other changes. Because if I'm right in that, the way you build new parts of your transit system changes. You want people to get between neighborhoods rather than a hub and spoke system that takes everybody just downtown. So to me, that's going to be an enduring change for cities from COVID, and the one that has the most interesting public policy ramifications. Because if you get 25% more people in a neighborhood all day, and they do things like go out and buy lunch, or they shop more locally, they want fresh food, whatever, there will be economic changes that follow and reinforce that trend.
You've touched on this, David, and you have some great examples in the book, but one of the viewers who hasn't perhaps had a chance to see the book yet would like to know, what do cities need to do to enable more people to, and I love the phrasing, enable more people to walk and roll to get around?
Well, there's a whole, that's great phrasing. I like that. And, and discussing with Graham when we were in the green room beforehand, I just got back from my daily vigorous bike ride. So I like the idea of opening up more space to roll. I think it's been pretty remarkable during COVID. In Toronto, for example, we had been debating since the municipal election in 2000 whether our main east-west artery, Bloor Street, should have bike lanes. Some were put in 2 or 3 years ago on a small stretch of it, a mile or two. This summer, in the space of about 3 weeks, right across a huge swath of the city, probably about 17 miles, maybe more, maybe 20 miles, bike lanes were put in, like this. And what we've seen is that mayors have been seizing the moment as people demand a change to allow it to be walkable and rollable now. And I don't think that's going to go back. I would look to Paris again and Barcelona for really good implementation of these ideas. And Barcelona's approach has been very thoughtful because, unrelated to COVID or climate change, they were building what they call super blocks. So sort of small neighborhoods within a neighborhood for social service reasons. There would be social service workers there who would meet the needs of the neighborhood. And they've started to use that super block idea around transportation and repurposing roads for local purposes. So you come to it, you're in a place rather than trying to get cut through it with a car. And also thinking about that in the context of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, using the super blocks as a consultation platform for their climate plan, which resulted in low-income neighborhoods saying fuel poverty was an issue. Can you subsidize us to do energy retrofits of our buildings so we lower the amount of energy we use? I think those are the interesting examples and trends, and it's around planning, how we think about planning, and how we think about people are using space. If more people are going to stay in their neighborhoods, it becomes easier to repurpose public space for working and cycling, because you don't have as much demand from people who don't live there to use the roads to cut through to go somewhere else, because there's fewer of them doing it. And it's going to be very interesting to see what elected officials are able to do with that changed dynamic. For me, creating ways for people to safely get around by foot and by wheel, it also has massive public health positive implications and creates a more fun, interesting city. Bit tough in January in Boston or Toronto, but so what? If you're like our family, you don't own a car, that time of the year, I will ride, but you can take transit. So I think COVID's given us an opportunity. I don't like to use the word opportunity because it's inappropriate. So many people have died, and I almost did, but it's really given us a necessity of re-examining how we do things, and people have started to like what they see.
Hey, David, when I lived in Wisconsin, people used to like to say that there's no such thing as bad weather, there's just bad clothing. So I won't ride on snow and ice, but I have ridden bikes in Boston in January. Another of our viewers raises the important question about regional differences. And it was so interesting that you mentioned Houston before as a place that had a climate action plan, because of course, instinctively you think, well, sure, Boston and the East Coast cities are probably doing something and Los Angeles and certainly San Francisco. But what about the other cities? How successful are we in spreading this concern and this quest for action to perhaps less expected regions?
Well, I think what's fascinating is you have seen a big movement across the U.S., starting actually in the Bush government with former Mayor Greg Nickel of Seattle at the time, who got something like 3,000 mayors to sign up to Kyoto. I can't remember the figures, and he's not mentioned in the book, but there has been a commitment to the principle of American cities for a very long time. There's also been a commitment to climate plans. I think the challenge today from a city perspective is a lot of the older plans weren't sufficiently ambitious because science has showed us that we need to be more ambitious, partly because national governments aren't really acting globally, even the ones that say a lot. Within that, there are some really sparkling examples. The city of Des Moines in Iowa fought the state government who tried to use preemption to prevent them setting building codes that required higher standards for buildings. Very bold. Mayor Turner in Houston, some will say, oh, well, this climate plan doesn't quite get you where you need to. I fundamentally disagree. I think it's incredibly powerful that the world capital of the oil industry has a really profound climate change that at least arguably takes their fair share of reducing global greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030. And then there's the leaders you'd expect, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, so forth. Atlanta's been doing very good and interesting work. Pittsburgh, we all remember Mayor Peduto when President-elect Trump, who was in the midst of his transition at the time, I believe, and was being very aided by the transition funds that had been freed up for him, said, I'm pulling out of Paris because I represent Pittsburgh, not Paris. And Mayor Peduto said, I represent Pittsburgh and we're staying in. So there is a movement, large and small, and there's some really interesting spin-offs. And if I could just go a bit long on this question, if it's okay, Grant.
Please.
I mentioned C40 had a program called Deadline 2020, and it's important to explain what that was and is. Post-Paris, C40 did an analysis of what do we need to do as cities, our group of cities, to do our share. And the first thing we said was Paris had a higher ambition of 1.5 degrees. It was clear to everybody that really needed to be the ambition, not a higher one. So we said, that's our ambition, 1.5 degrees. And I would give kudos here to Mark Watts, the executive director, Mayor Anne Hidalgo, who was just becoming the chair at this time, for their leadership, because that's now become the de facto standard globally. Nobody talks about 2 degrees anymore. It's wrong. But mayors with actual governments representing about 25% of the world economy and over 700 million people in their city regions took that decision. And then they said it's a criteria of membership of C40 to have a climate plan that peaks emissions by 2020, a little bit later in the developing world, more or less have them by 2030 to net zero by 2050, because that's what science tells us our share is. And if you don't have that kind of plan, sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to leave our organization. And by the end of this year, most of our cities will have those kinds of plans, almost all of them by the end of the first quarter next year. In some places in the developing world that have been slowed down massively because of COVID this year. And I don't know the current figures, but as of a year ago, 34 cities had already peaked emissions, including Toronto. There's scientific rigor to all of that. really significant. And what's happened is the idea has started to flow to other cities. So Denmark has a program where Copenhagen is working with a local philanthropic charity called Real Dania. They're a funder of C40 to create a DK 2020. And they're helping smaller cities in Denmark do the same kind of thing. And there are dozens and dozens that now have climate plans to the same standard. And those cities are now reaching out, just starting to, but reaching out globally, and have reached out to some cities in Canada, and will be hosting a meeting between those cities and smaller places in Canada. So the fundamental ideas apply to a whole range, not just the biggest cities, although they break the ground, to a whole range. All you have to do is have a plan. Where are your greenhouse gas emissions? How do you address them? Use the best ideas. Here you go.
Stephen raises a topic that you discuss appropriately at some length in the book, and that is public transportation. And we haven't really touched on that in this session this afternoon, however. And Stephen asks whether or not there is strong investment in public transportation can assist in this effort. And I know the answer is yes, but take it away, David. Talk more about transportation and the climate crisis. Public transportation.
Stephen, your music to my ears. I grew up, before I immigrated to Canada, I lived in a small village in England. And when I was 7, I took the bus from that village. It was outside Cambridge, several miles. Took the bus into Cambridge by myself, actually. Probably wouldn't be legal nowadays. The public bus. So I've been riding public transportation since 1966, and have a huge passion for it. It's one of the reasons I got involved in municipal politics in the first place. And there's no question in my mind that in the great cities of the world, the efficacy of the public transport system is inextricably linked with the economic success of the city, the social integration, and of course, the environmental quality. And there's a whole range of things here. Cities need a network of public transportation so that people can choose not to drive and can safely and easily get around. It needs to be affordable. The network needs to be electricity based. Even with a dirty grid, you're better off, but preferably a clean electricity grid. So C40, for example, has been working very extensively on electrification of bus systems. A few years ago, our cities had about 100 buses. Now there's 66,000 electric buses on the streets of C40 cities led by Chinese cities. And it also needs to be thoughtfully done in a way that ensures that people in low-income neighborhoods can get a chance to access rapid transit as well, whether that's by busway, light rail running in the surface like Boston's Green Lines, or subway, depends on the density and a whole bunch of other things. But many places, gentrification has meant that people in low-income neighborhoods have to rely on the bus, don't get a chance to have rapid transit. Now, there is an additional complication in many US cities, which are sprawl-based. It's very hard to retrofit a sprawl-based city with public transport, but incredibly critical to do it. Those cities, you also have to rely on the electrification of private transport as well, because changing a sprawl-based city like Houston into a denser one like Chicago or New York with great public transit is exceptionally challenging indeed. But for me, public transit is at the heart of it. It's the heart of making a great city. It is at the heart of making sure it's socially just and economically successful, not just in dramatically lowering greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you. Moher raises a really interesting point. He says that there's a trend in Europe to remunicipalize utilities, a way to engage community, accelerate local development of renewable energy, and bolster local resilience. Does this make sense to you? And let me just add to that, that one of the things that just struck me in reading your book was that in Toronto, you had a city-owned utility. I think it was shared with maybe with the university, but it did really interesting things to tackle climate change, to reduce the demand for electricity through using lake water for cooling and stuff like that. And then you mentioned that it's since been privatized. Do you have any thoughts on this? Having been mayor when you had what seems to have been a very innovative, publicly owned, city-owned utility, and then it's been privatized. Any thoughts on public versus private ownership of utilities and climate change?
Yes, and there's a subtlety in Toronto's case, which I'll get to at the end. I fundamentally think that electricity should be delivered by public utilities. The challenges with climate change and the fight back of US private utilities over their insistence on using coal can be compared with Ontario's experience, in which because the Ontario government owned the generating facilities that were coal-based, it was just able to close them, repurpose the workers to other jobs. There was no fight over just transition. They just did a just transition. Electricity generation is a public good. I think I would be comfortable in a modern way with allowing some private generation, as long as everything else is owned publicly, because that will push to ensure that we have distributed generation, which is important. In Germany, their model is very interesting because if we lived there, we could all put solar panels on our house and sell it very easily into the grid. That's much harder to do in most of North America for a whole bunch of reasons, but very few of which are technical. They're more to do with the history of having a hub and spoke kind of grid with incumbents having great political power. So I fully agree, and I think the renationalization should happen in the United States as well. I think it's a very good idea. And some of the leading US cities like Austin and Los Angeles own their own electric utilities, and Los Angeles is the Department of Water and Power from the city. And they've kept it public because it's of strategic importance there to ensure a supply of electricity and to ensure a supply of water. And that's in a city that is essentially an oil field. Los Angeles is an oil field. It has oil wells working in the city right now, and they still have a public utility. The subtlety about Toronto is we have two utilities, Toronto Hydro, which owns distribution but not the generation, and one called Enwave, which owns certain other assets, including steam heating and deep lake water cooling. Enwave was the one privatized. It's a subtlety, but my view is these are assets that should be in public hands. There's a public purpose, and we can see in the fight in the US with private utilities to try and change their behavior why it's been such a problem to have privatized them so thoughtlessly.
And you mentioned, you promised that you'd tell us something subtle about Toronto.
I'm not sure what I was thinking of there, Graham, but how about this? In 2007, we passed a climate plan called Changes in the Air. It was passed unanimously by Toronto City Council, which was 44 members and a mayor. And there are no political parties, at least not fully organized and legal ones. Most politicians, of course, belong to one of several political parties in Canada. Could be Greens, Conservatives, a New Democratic Party, which Bernie Sanders would be to the right of, just to give you some perspective, Liberals, and there's some other parties in different provinces. But essentially, council, you're dealing with 44 different political parties. So the fact it passed unanimously meant there was a broad consensus of citizens, which is very important. As a result of that plan and the provincial closing of a coal-fired plant, and that plan addressed the sectors I've been discussing, how you heat and cool buildings, how you generate electricity, how you manage your waste and transportation. Toronto is now 33% below its greenhouse gas levels from 1990. And that's not the city operations, that's the geographic area as a whole. And in that time, Toronto's been booming. In fact, it's created issues of affordable housing and all sorts of things. But the economy has been very strong. Issues of distribution and inequity, absolutely. But the fundamental idea that taking action on climate is inconsistent with good economic performance is demonstrably wrong. And the fact that Toronto, a big growing city, can address climate in this way with such success, I think shows that it can be done anywhere.
Terrific. Staying with electricity, Anne asks about your thoughts about electric vehicles and recharging them. I know that you address this in the book, but perhaps you could just say a bit about it now.
Well, I think, first of all, you want to ensure that your public transit is entirely electric, but very close second is addressing fleets. And this isn't always within the full power of the city, although they can show leadership. New York City, for example, has shown incredible leadership in its fleets, as it has on buildings. And if there's time, I can speak to that as well. But it has something like 11,000 vehicles in its fleet that are electric. It's incredible. And fleets matter because if you think about who's on the streets today, there's there are cars, often single occupancy. There are fleets, delivery fleets like Postal Service, Purolator, and so forth, and public transport. Those fleets are very susceptible to easy electrification because you can charge the vehicles at their home, at their depot. And that's why New York City has been very successful in the electrification of its fleet. You can centrally charge them. And there is no economic reason today why certainly all the delivery services couldn't be electric today. The vehicles are manufactured, and over the lifetime of the vehicle, it is the same cost or cheaper than buying a gas or diesel powered vehicle because of the lower maintenance costs. Final point is individual transportation. This is going to be critical in places like Houston. The charging infrastructure is more complicated than a fleet, but there's a guide in Canada. We have charging infrastructure across the Trans-Canada Highway to enable people in electric vehicles to cross this country. So it is possible. The best city examples are places like Vancouver, which for quite a while, probably almost a decade, have been requiring new condominium buildings to have electric charge points in the buildings. But there is a slight chicken and egg here. People are reluctant to buy electric vehicles because they are worried about the range and getting them charged, and they're still expensive to buy, even if they're cheaper to maintain. It's hard to bring the cost down because of that problem of purchasing them, and it's hard to get the infrastructure built without a real demand push. So I think the conclusion is we take the best examples of cities. Places like London, England are really pushing the installation of charge points. Seattle, Vancouver, and take those best examples and get the charging infrastructure going so that people will feel far more comfortable about using electric vehicles.
Thank you. Randy asks about the criteria for belonging to C40. You mentioned before the requirement to have a plan by this year on addressing climate change issues, but more generally, what are the requirements for a city to join the C40?
In the short version, you need to be one of the world's larger cities, a city above 3 million. the mayor needs personally to commit to leading climate action. It's a coalition of mayors. It's not a coalition of cities, despite the name. It was originally 40 when Ken Livingston brought us all together, and Toronto was a founding member in 2005. There were 40 cities. Basically, that's it. There's no dues. We're funded by philanthropy predominantly. But the idea is the mayor's a leader. You're a city over 3 million. And that's because the underlying theory is that the larger cities can break through barriers because they have the financial and staff resources to do so. It's a bit harder for smaller cities to break through all barriers, although they can be very innovative themselves. And you have to commit to having a climate plan along the lines I said. There's one other category that's relevant. We call them innovator cities. So a city like Portland is a member, even though they're not big enough, because those cities have done something extraordinary. So Copenhagen would be one, Stockholm. I think New Orleans is an innovator city, Portland, Vancouver. But in general terms, and certainly all the new cities, 3 million personal commitment and demonstrated leadership from the mayor, and a commitment to deadline 2020.
Thank you. We are going to run out of time, so I'm dancing around a little bit with the questions, but to try to make sure we cover all the topics. But one of the important concerns that's on the minds of all of us these days is the question of social inequities. And one of our viewers asks, can cities make major advances in climate action without exacerbating social inequities and causing problems such as green gentrification? Again, I know you've got interesting comments. I urge people to read the book, but can you give us some comments today, David, on that?
Yeah, to me, that's, thank you for the question. And to me, that's at the heart of the challenge of climate change. And the best examples of cities like New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Barcelona, Toronto, are cities, well, the Toronto of a decade ago perhaps, but are cities that in their climate plan recognize that equity was at the heart of it, and that if you don't, you both have to think about how you address equity and address it as a matter of policy and fact, but also include people from neighborhoods that are economically challenged in the development of the plan. And if you don't, your plan won't be right, first of all, because you haven't had the best advice, and the best advice is from the people who are in those circumstances. But secondly, you might lose political acceptance for your plan. So, I think one of the reasons Toronto's climate plan passed unanimously was because we did very significant work across the city, but particularly looking to our priority neighborhoods. What a priority neighborhood was when I was mayor was a neighborhood that was a priority for public investment, because it had a significant correlation between low incomes and a lack of historic public investment, and therefore public services. So job training, libraries, community centers, trees, public investment. And we worked very hard in those priority neighborhoods to engage people. And we had, so what does that look like in practical terms? The transit plan we developed ended up serving, it was a new plan for rapid transit by light rail, laid over a city that has essentially two subway lines, one north-south, one east-west. A bit more complicated than that, but doesn't matter. The light rail plan was laid over that and created a grid around the city. And it served all of the low-income neighborhoods, and it wasn't by accident. And what did that mean to people? Well, I went to one neighborhood called Malvern, which was a priority neighborhood at the time, at about 6 in the morning, to canvass people on their buses to talk to them about the fact that we wanted to change that bus route into a light rail route. And I met a woman. She said, "Mayor, what are you doing on my bus at 6 o'clock in the morning?" And I said, I wanted to talk to you about light rail, and gave her a glossy brochure, leaflet. And she said, what's light rail? And I said, well, think of European style trams riding on tracks down the middle of the road. They will be in their own right of way, so cars don't get in their way when they're turning left. And they'll get you to your destination faster and be more likely to be on time than your bus. And she said, oh, that would be great. That would really help me. And I said, where are you going to work? Where do you work? She said, the airport. The airport was on the other side of Toronto, about 30 miles away. And I said, how do you get there? Bus, bus, subway, subway, bus, bus. Boy, you must have a long day. Mayor, that's only my morning job. In the afternoon, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel, which is downtown. Bus, bus, subway. And then to get home, subway, subway, bus, bus. She spent about 3 hours and 45 minutes a day on public transport. If rapid transit came to her neighborhood, it would be transformational for her, even if only saved her an hour a day, because she would be able to do things like have dinner with her family, or if she wanted, do what my mom did and go back to school. My mom graduated from university at the age of 56. I'm an only child from a single mom. She graduated at the age of 56, and it helped her greatly in her career after that. You know, this woman, if she had an hour a day, might be able to go back to school. There was a college, Centennial College, near where she lived, and upgrade her skills so she could have one job. So incredibly important socially and economically, not just environmentally. And that all came about because city staff, under direction of council in my office, had systematically integrated people from low-income neighborhoods into the planning and discussing about how we created a transit plan and who would it serve. Very long-winded answer, Graham. I'm sorry to take so long, but I think it's critical. You know, the U.S. at this moment, when there's a big reckoning with a real history of injustice based on racial background, it's exceptionally important that people be included in the conversation, that their needs be understood, and that they have a real say over the outcome. And if you do, they'll be with you and they'll have your back, and they'll be the biggest proponents of city-based climate action. But if you don't, and you don't meet their needs, they're going to fight you, and they should. And so I think it's a spot-on question. Equity is at the heart of all this, and if we don't address climate change in an equitable way, it's unfair to start with. Caused by the rich, it has the biggest impact on the least, those who have the least. If we don't address it in an equitable way, we're not going to be able to do it.
Thank you. I need to give my apologies to the many people who wanted to ask questions. Time always flies by when I'm talking with you, and it has on this occasion. I can't resist asking one final question. I don't know if President-elect Biden happens to be watching, maybe he isn't, but what message would you give to President-elect Biden about climate and climate change policy as he, as we all assume and hope, prepares for the presidency?
I'd give two. The first is, I'd say, President-elect Biden, you have a moment with the stimulus package that you'll have to bring in next spring to invest massively in climate solutions in urban areas across America. By working with mayors, you can make these solutions tailored to the needs of the people in different cities. And it will not only help bring the American economy back, it is a once in a lifetime chance to ensure we meet the needs of our planet and really solve climate change. And secondly, I would say mayors and cities are your ally. They're your ally in the United States, and they're your ally around the world. The United States has been absent from climate leadership for 4 years. With your leadership, the U.S. again could engage internationally, particularly with international cities through organizations like ours and others. You could help lead massive climate action in Asia, in Africa and elsewhere through the leadership of the United States, through its moral leadership, and through its international aid, through USAID and others, USAID. There's a huge opportunity. Cities are your friend, and we look forward as mayors to working with you.
David, thank you so much. Once again, apologies to the people who asked questions that we didn't get to, but I hope that you found answers in many of David's answers to questions that were asked. The C40 website, David, some of the questions asked were about the C40. In fact, like which cities are members, and I'm sure that if people Google C40, they will be able to find your website and that information. I want to thank you for taking part and sharing this afternoon with us. David's book, Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Solving the Climate Crisis, was published by the University of Toronto Press. It's available in print and also through Kindle, and I highly recommend it. David, thanks so much for this afternoon and your comments today.
Thanks so much for having me, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody, and best